Protecting the Unprotected, the story of Margaret Sanger. On March 3, 1873, Congress passed the Comstock Act, which prohibited the trade and circulation of obscene and immoral materials, a category which they considered birth control or information about birth control to fall under. This act, along with the attitude towards contraception and women's rights at the time, forbid women and families from accessing family planning resources, creating a barrier between women and freedom.
Beginning in the early 1900s, Margaret Sanger became a national leader in the women's rights movement as she devoted her life to breaking both the social and economic barriers for women, defying laws that kept them subordinate to their male counterparts, and working to secure access to reproductive rights. Sanger founded Planned Parenthood and advocated for oral contraception, believing this key to enabling women to lead fulfilling, independent lives, leading her influence and work to continue impacting women today. Born on September 14, 1884, and growing up in Corning, New York, Margaret Sanger was exposed to many injustices women faced because of their lack of access to contraception. As Gloria Steinem stated in 1998 in a Time article about Sanger, born into an Irish working-class family, Margaret witnessed her mother's slow death, worn out after 18 pregnancies and 11 live births. Her mother, Anne Purcell Higgins, later died of tuberculosis at the young age of 48. Sanger also suffered from this ailment, which is explained in her book, Woman, Morality, and Birth Control.
In Sanger's early career, she attended the nursing program at White Plains Hospital. As Steinem mentioned, while working as a practical nurse and midwife in the poorest neighborhoods of New York City, she saw women deprived of their health, sexuality, and ability to care for children already born. At this time, she also married her first husband, William Sanger, and had 3 children, Stuart, Grant, and Peggy.
She realized many women were coming to the hospital after attempting extremely dangerous self-abortions out of desperation due to the prohibition of birth control under the Comstock Act. This is when she began her pursuit of justice for women across the country. Her biggest mentor on her new endeavor was Emma Goldman, an anarchist writer and political activist who was especially influential in North America and Europe. They shared correspondence over the years as Goldman led Sanger through the world of breaking barriers.
In 1914, at the beginning of her activism, Sanger decided to start a magazine called The Woman Rebel. In the first edition of this piece, Sanger states, "The aim of this paper will be to stimulate working women to think for themselves and to build up a conscious fighting character." Her mentor, Goldman, also contributed to a section of this paper called Rebel Thoughts, where she referred to how women will gain freedom. She said her development, her freedom, her independence must come from and through herself, by refusing the right to anyone over her body, by refusing to bear children unless she wants them, by refusing to be a servant to God, the state, society, the husband, the family, etc.
Many people believe that her work was partly fueled by her religious beliefs, which she spoke of later in her life.
Could it be then that in part at least you were driven emotionally toward the birth control movement because of antagonism toward the church?
No, I don't think I had anything of the kind in mind. I was what I would call a born humanitarian.
This magazine was ruled to be in violation of Section 211 of the U.S. Criminal Code, which prohibited the distribution of birth control information. After Sanger realized that she would have to face a 5-year jail sentence, she fled to England, leaving her 3 children with her husband and his family. In her time there, she worked in the women's movement and helped break barriers relating to women's rights and birth control internationally.
About a year later, William Sanger began to receive publicity for distributing Sanger's pamphlet, Family Limitations, which was written before she left. He was arrested and gained popularity among Sanger supporters in the U.S. She immediately returned for his trial and to regain her place as the provider of liberation for women, even though she could have immediately been arrested herself.
Shortly after being back, however, Margaret Sanger's youngest daughter, at the age of only 5, passed away from severe pneumonia, which was heartbreaking for Sanger. This led to public outrage that the case convicting a grieving mother was still open, and it was dismissed soon after with a pardon from the United States Attorney.
In 1916, Margaret Sanger also broke the barrier of inadequate access to birth control with the first constructive birth control clinic, a concept introduced by a European birth control activist who worked in London, Marie Stopes. Sanger used the opportunity to gain publicity and informed all the news reporters in the area, even though she knew that this was illegal. 10 days after opening the clinic, Sanger and her team, including her sister Ethel Byrne, were sent to jail for defying the Comstock Act. Byrne went on a hunger strike and was let out early. However, Sanger refused to compromise her values by paying the fine and was therefore sentenced 30 days in jail.
Even after Sanger deliberately disobeyed the law, women all over the country still put their faith in her. They sent her letters explaining their struggles with unwanted pregnancies and the tragedies that followed. One woman wrote, I am the mother of 12 children, 3 living, 9 dead. I am a poor woman, 34 years old, and been married 15 years. Please tell me what to do. Who benefits by this agony, by the waste? Does the state? Sanger later added, does society? These letters fueled her to fight for these women as she connected to these stories and knew that this was a barrier that needed to be broken.
In 1918, as America was involved in World War I, Sanger wrote about how many soldiers overseas were being infected with certain illnesses that could pose a serious threat to their families back home. She felt it incredibly important to warn citizens about this danger to protect the health of Americans. She stated, "If the legal restrictions preventing the circulation of birth control information are removed before the end of the war, we shall then be free to help the homecoming soldiers and their young wives to understand how they may defer the conception of their children until the danger period of the venereal infection is conquered." Although some people strongly associate Margaret Sanger with the eugenics movement, a highly criticized field which is defined as the science with the stated aim of improving a human population by controlled breeding to increase the occurrence of desirable heritable characteristics, her involvement with the movement was incredibly misunderstood. At the time, the eugenics movement was an incredibly respected scientific movement with the influential supporters like Theodore Roosevelt and Alexander Graham Bell.
Trying to get more respect from the scientific and medical communities for the birth control movement. They thought it was just this amateur movement created by feminist crazies. So she begins to support the eugenics movement, which is a very established scientific movement. She didn't hold those views, but she didn't condemn the people who did. And the question is put to her, do you want to use birth control to control any particular race or religion or ethnic group? She says, no, of course not.
In the late 1930s, Sanger's supporters across the country were outraged that there was no adequate federal action being taken to solve the problem of birth control. Both professionals and regular civilians were writing letters to President Franklin D. Roosevelt pleading for action to be taken. Doctors would quote statistics, such as the following letter written to the president in 1938, which mentioned out of around 45 million women living in the U.S. at the time, none of which had access to adequate birth control, annually 77,000 recorded stillbirths, of which 25,000 were caused by the mother suffering from venereal disease or sexually transmitted disease, 60,000 recorded infant deaths within 2 weeks of being born, and 12,544 deaths of mothers because of complications during the pregnancy. They mentioned how the chief of the U.S. Children's Bureau refused to address birth control. Many letters also quoted President Roosevelt's vague comment on birth control. He stated, "Preserving the life and health of mothers and newborn babies is of the first importance in safeguarding family life and the welfare of the whole people." Many people used this quote to empower the president to continue working in this direction and to take a definitive stance on birth control, although he never did.
One of Sanger's most powerful swings at the barrier of women's non-existent access to safe contraception was the founding of Planned Parenthood. The ultimate objective of the movement as a whole is stated as to democratize and to make universally available the best scientific knowledge of contraception in order to raise the standards of health for mothers and children and to reduce the infant and maternal death rate. However, Sanger's involvement in the organization began decreasing as it gained more money and attracted wealthier men and women to take control of higher positions. Sanger's final achievement that broke the barrier of depriving women of effective and safe contraception was the birth control pill. The pill was created in 1950 called Inovid and was later approved by the Food and Drug Administration in 1960. This not only gave women an easy, convenient alternative to being burdened with more children than they could properly care for, but also allowed them the freedom to not be subdued by their husbands and families and to choose a lifestyle of their own.
Even after Sanger's death, her legacy was continued through her organization, Planned Parenthood, which has grown to the point of international influence, now helping women in countries like India and Nigeria gain access to these vital family planning resources while continuing to expand in the U.S. The International Planned Parenthood Council is led by her grandson, Alexander Sanger. Margaret Sanger may be incredibly controversial, but her real worth is evident in the broken barriers that she left behind and the barriers that continue to be broken by women around the world because of the freedom that they now have.
There was a certain satisfaction in doing something that was going to alleviate the sufferings of women.
Margaret Sanger's impact lives on today because of the barriers she broke in her lifetime. Her work still impacts a large percentage of women and families to this day through Planned Parenthood. Sanger revolutionized the way women were perceived in society, from weak and easy to dominate to independent and powerful. Not only did her movement produce the tangible impact of the birth control pill, but it also liberated women to continue breaking barriers of their own.